Hi, I'm David Berlin, Editor-in-Chief of Programmable Web, and we're here today with Greg Koberger. He is the founder of Readme.io. For those of you not familiar with Readme.io, they have a bit of a history when it comes to hosting documentation. A lot of API providers like to use Readme.io to host their documentation. But I'll defer to you, Greg. Welcome, first of all, to our show.
Thanks.
Yeah, it's great to have you here. So the first thing I really want to ask is give me a little bit of the history of Readme.io before we get into what it is you're announcing this week.
Sure. So Readme is, like you mentioned, a company that we do kind of a documentation platform for APIs. We've got a bunch of really cool companies using us, a bunch of small companies, a bunch of startups, a bunch of big companies, Box and Lyft and Intercom, and a bunch of companies have used us for their API documentation. We got started about 3 years ago. We launched. Our anniversary is next week, 3-year anniversary. And yeah, we kind of started. The goal was always to get as far deep into APIs as possible. Our mindset was always that the documentation isn't just a static, boring thing that you kind of like push a static site. It should be interactive. It should, know about the user. It should adapt and learn about the user. It shouldn't just be, a GitHub pages repo where, there's just paragraphs of text. You need that stuff, of course. We always kind of believe that the API documentation is really the interface for the API. So we've kind of worked to make API documentation as, as interactive as you'd expect from any other website.
Okay. And so things have been going pretty well. About how many API providers do you think today are using your website as the host of their documentation?
Sure. So we have about 3,000 paying companies, and then we've got about 10,000 total of like open source, et cetera, projects. We do everything. We do about half of those are APIs. The other half are product documentation, other types of documentation. So I guess to kind of put it another way, about 1,500 APIs are hosted on us.
And any customers of note, like big customers that we would recognize?
Sure.
API providers, it is?
Yep. So some of the big ones are like Box uses us for their documentation, their API documentation. Lyft's API documentation is all on us. Intercom, Trello, a few Atlassian projects, Zenefits. We've been lucky that we've been able to work with some really cool, big companies. We have some bigger ones like IBM, Microsoft uses for stuff. Tons of little startups all over. So yeah, we've kind of run the gamut of like big companies, really cool medium-sized companies, and a ton of small companies.
Now, documentation is talked about ad nauseum in the various circles of the API economy. Everybody always talks about how important it is to engage developers with very compelling documentation, and of course other features that a lot of developer evangelists and API providers will use to hook and attract developers. What would you say are, you've been in the space now for about 3 years, as you said. What would you say are some of the key factors to offering really compelling documentation?
Sure. I think one of the best and worst things that happen to APIs and API documentation is Stripe. And it's because everyone absolutely loves Stripe, and rightfully so. They really knocked it out of the park with their documentation. And that's a good thing. The bad thing, and this is not their fault whatsoever, is that I think people take the wrong thing away from Stripe's documentation, for example. They see the 3-column layout, think this is pretty, and think that's what makes good API documentation. And attractiveness is, of course, important. Like, you wouldn't want ugly anything. But I think the reason why Stripe's and Twilio, I think, are the two that I get the most feedback on, are like, the gold standard of documentation. It's not because they are pretty or anything like that, or because they have tons of paragraphs of text. It's because it's so well integrated. They're not static. They know exactly who you are. They know your API keys. They know the last call you made. It's all very well integrated. You can play around with it. So I think the things that are really important is I think that you definitely need a reference guide. That is like that. You've seen those gigantic 3-column layout pages, just like Stripes, with the black columns on the right side. And I think you definitely need that. But I think that too many people stop there. And for me, that's kind of like handing someone the dictionary and saying, learn English. It's supposed to be a reference guide. It's not supposed to be the documentation. I think what people really need is, or what documentation needs, is it needs a lot more than just that. It needs the biggest comparator to documentation is like Stack Overflow, not their documentation product, just their question and answer. Because I don't want to put words in your mouth, but if you have a problem with an API and you Google it and you see the official site and then you see right below it a very similar question on Stack Overflow, I click Stack Overflow. And I think so support forms, things like that are really important to documentation. To have those integrated in is really important.
Right.
And I think examples are the biggest thing. Again, to put words in your mouth, what I do at least is when I go to a site, I scroll down to find the code snippet and copy and paste it and just kind of, I could probably say myself a lot of times if I read paragraphs of text, but I don't. So I think like interactive, API documentation where you can actually like see examples and copy and paste. Nobody wants to go to a reference guide and see the URL is this, the parameters are this, and have to like in their own language, Python, Rails, etc. Reassemble it into a call and then try to make the call. It's really frustrating. At Readme, we kind of measure the MVC, the minimum viable call, the time to that. So from, let's say you want to use a random API, like the thing that's most valuable to us is getting you from deciding to use the API to making some sort of innocuous call. It doesn't really matter what it is, but it should be kind of important. It should show that you did something that's kind of important. Your API key is working properly. You have the SDK, if there's an SDK set up properly. Like, once you get that, it's kind of gravy from there. But I think too many companies leave out that like onboarding flow of like, how do we get David from, this seems like a cool API to like, oh, I posted a tweet, or I, got a list of my friends, or I updated my status on this site, or whatever, in as little time as possible. And after that, you can like, you'll be more inclined to like dig through the documentation and learn more and figure out more. In my mind, there's nothing worse than using an API and just seeing a 1,000 endpoint gigantic page. It takes 2 minutes to load and it's alphabetically ordered and it's just endpoints like /user. And like to create a new user, you have to do like post/user. And like that makes sense to you and I, but like it just gets tiring just
to the rest of the world.
Like,
yeah.
Yeah. And even to me, it doesn't make sense. I mean, it makes sense, but like you have to think about it and it's not natural, I don't think.
I think one of the things that I run into, which I still haven't seen anybody really fix this particular problem, is sometimes you run into APIs that are best implemented on the server side, which means that within the documentation environment, it's a little more difficult to offer some sort of interactive capability for testing that API. Like you have to launch a node or something, node environment or something like that. I'm surprised like Heroku, who you're familiar with, hasn't gone and said, hey, we're going to provide, this sort of point and click sandbox for API onboarding. That way you just embed that.
I'm here to promote my company, but I'm going to keep promoting Stripe, I guess. Stripe recently bought a company called Tonic. They renamed it to RunKit. It's pretty cool. You should check it out. Like that's exactly what it is. It's like, you can play around with it in line. It's so much easier because like, it's so nice to know that it works, to just be able to click go and just get a response back and be like, oh, that was easy. I went through 100%. And unfortunately, we don't really do that either for Readme. We probably should get on that. We fake it as much as we can in the sense that like you can like see a Python code and you can like run it. And it's not actually running Python, but like as far as you're concerned, it could be.
Sort of virtualizes it. Yeah,
precisely.
And just going back to you talking about how Stripe and Twilio are kind of used as the, sort of poster children. Weren't they really preceded by Slate, which kind of really is the predecessor to that 3-column format?
I can't answer that. Let me phrase that. The understanding that I've always had was that it wasn't Slate. It was CoffeeScript was the inspiration for that 3-column layout. And CoffeeScript it was a little bit different. They had like all the code and then the code was annotated, but it was that 3-column thing. And the way I heard the story, and I don't know if it's true or not, was that it came from, that's where they kind of like got it from. And I think that Slate was a response to that. I think Slate came after that.
Slate came after, that's true. So, but I mean, Slate was really the first one to kind of establish a separate code base that that anybody could go grab from GitHub and just go do, right? And is Expedia that one that I put this
Tribbit. It's Tribbit.
Tribbit, that's right. I knew it was one of the travel companies. Okay, so there we go. We've taken a walk down memory lane. You guys you're here today to announce the next big thing from readme.io. So let's hear about it.
Yeah, so this isn't, so we talked about the current product, which is going to continue to be, the product that we spend a lot of time on, like we still love it. But one thing we've started to notice is that APIs are getting simpler and simpler. And, most APIs on us are attached to a company. They're attached to Lyft or Box or a big company.
Mm-hmm.
It's like a company API. And at ProgrammableWeb, I'm sure you see there's not a ton of really compelling APIs that aren't backed by a big brand name for whatever reason. And I think it's going to change over the next few years for a lot of reasons. So we're building something, it's very well integrated with the current product, but it's also very different, called Readme Build, which is a way to, rather than just document your API, it's to build it. It's a natural progression because, like we talked before, I think that the biggest thing that makes docs really good is how well integrated it is with the API. If you can print out the docs and it's just as good and static, that means that, let's say that you're making a call to an API and you keep getting errors and you don't know why. When you go to the docs, you want to know why. You want to know, oh, the API is just down. It's not my fault. I'll try again in a few hours. Or you want to know that, oh, David, unfortunately, your credit card's expired. Click this link to, it was a rate limiting problem. Click this link to pay or whatever. Or you want to know that you messed something up. You want to be able to debug it. Maybe they changed something. Who knows? But my opinion is that good API documentation should know when something's wrong. They should know when something's right. They should know when it's your first time using it and do something a little bit different. Things like that. So build works well with Readme, but it's kind of a simple way to build APIs. That's not the hard part. The hard part is, or the cool part, that's not the cool part. The cool part is that how well integrated is the docs, how well the docs now know about you.
So let me stop you there for one second. You say build APIs, and of course, for years we've discussed something called the API lifecycle, which consists of several different phases, that stretch from, planning, and trying to strategize just exactly what it is you're going to do, then designing the API that addresses that plan, and then launching the API. Hosting it, governance, managing things like API keys and security, mapping it back to, your back-end security, applying OAuth and so on. So analytics, managing all the users when you're issuing these keys, that sort of stuff. So which parts of that life cycle are you addressing with this product called Build?
Yep. So as companies get bigger, obviously the life cycle becomes more and more intricate. This is definitely aimed at either smaller companies or microservices or developers on the weekend, things like that. In theory, it does most of that. Obviously, not nearly as well as the companies that do it, well. But it does. The whole goal is to kind of do all of it and get you from idea to having API keys and all that stuff and logging all that within 2 minutes. Do you want me to do a quick demo and show you kind of what it's like to build an API?
That would be great. Let's go ahead. Let's go right into the demo. You're going to have to flip us into the screen sharing mode, but that would be great.
Okay, you're probably going to quick flash yourself, but okay.
Yep.
Okay, so this is Readme Build. Are you able to see this? I
sure am. Yep.
Perfect. So the whole concept is what would it be like if APIs were just stripped away everything that wasn't completely necessary? So it's really as easy to get started as typing, npm install API-G, and then API init. Oops, wrong way. There we go. Okay, can you see the terminal right now?
I can.
Perfect. Okay, so we're in a new. There's nothing in this directory or whatever. We're going to type API init. It's going to walk us through.
We've already installed.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Yep. So you'd have to type npm install API-G to get started. But once you do that, you can type API init. So we type API init. It's going to ask us for the service name. We're going to call it PW for ProgrammableWeb. We'll do version 0.001. And we're going to do a really simple. We'll call it multiply. We'll multiply two numbers together. You can use a database, stuff like that, but we're not going to do that for now. So it sets it up. So now we have a few files in here. For anyone who's familiar with serverless or Lambda or stuff like that, it's definitely very similar to that. The only big difference is that the focus for us is on the end consumer eventually, not the creation of the API. And we'll understand what that means in a few minutes. So now I'm going to edit this multiply file, which, okay. So the comments are actually important in this. This is where all the documentation is done. It lives right. So you said the API lifecycle. We kind of threw it all in one file. For whatever reason, my computer's not like that. Okay, so we're going to type multiply two numbers, and then we're just going to have an x. First number. I'll do y. It's very similar to like Java Docs or even like Swagger or something like that, but it's right in line. And result. Okay, so there's that. We're gonna write this in Node.
That was a comment though, right? Like
Yep.
It looks like you're using, we're in JavaScript here, and that's just basically a set of comments that you wrote. So, and is that something that your documentation capability picks up on? Like
yes.
Yeah. Okay.
So there's a few things. It's great for, on one hand, it's good for just anyone editing the file to kind of know, what's going in, what's coming out, stuff like that. But eventually we'll see when we deploy it. The information I just typed out will be the documentation. It'll also take care of validation. It'll make sure that you have the right values being passed in, they're the right type, stuff like that. You can see that I did, x is equal to 5 and y is equal to 3. Those are the defaults. So if you don't pass those in, that's what that is. Okay. So we're done here.
What's the export? That's the code right there. We go back to that and take a look at that real quick.
Yep, of course.
Because that's the actual code, right? So
Yep. So module exports is just a node. That's the way that in Node you kind of like say this is it. This is like it was the boilerplate code that shows up. We do have the API module, so you also can type it out as API.create, multiply, and and it's a little more. So this is the more like Node-y way, and then we have a more like easy to understand kind of way.
Okay.
So I went with the Node-y way because that was just the way that
and that's just the validation. You're just checking to see that there's data there in the two.
So it's a really simple API. Obviously, this should not be an API because we're just multiplying two numbers. But
no, I get it. I just so for people who are watching, they're like, well, what's that? For anybody who doesn't really understand what's going on here, and all that is an if statement that checks the contents of X and Y to make sure that there's something in there. And then the error dialog that throws the validation error. Yes. Yeah, so
and there's two options. It can either be a error or a success. So if it's an API.error, then we know that it's the API is going to take care of all the standardized responses and making sure it's returned properly. And if it's success, we know that's returning a number and it's going to be the result.
Just doing the math there. Yeah.
Yep. Exactly.
Okay. Very good.
What we can do right now is we can actually run it locally, just test it out.
Sure.
So we type API local multiply x equal to 3. And I'm going to leave the y out because we're going to get an error. This is going to be a mistake on purpose. Okay, so we got an error. Validation error. We must provide all required fields. So let's try this again. We'll do y is equal to 5. It's going to do math quick. 15. Perfect. Okay, so I'm pretty happy with this. My API, as far as I'm concerned, good to go. And I want you to use it now. So I'm going to just type API deploy. And it's going to ask me a few questions. We're going to make it a free public API. All APIs built on build are free as long as they're public. If you want to use it internally, then it would cost money, but it's free. And we got a little URL here. So I'm going to click this URL. And we're going to see our documentation. So this was built kind of on the fly. This is our API we just built. There's a bunch of different ways to consume it on the command line, on Node, Python, we have Slack, we have a Google Sheets integration. Because I don't really think that APIs need to be consumed by someone who's writing Python, for example, or Rails. There's a lot of really great use cases for APIs that don't involve it being used by someone who is a programmer, who has a CS degree.
Now, let me stop you there and just ask a question. For security reasons, some APIs are purely designed to be consumed with a server-side language, because we want to kind of protect some of the information that's crossing over the wire between the consumer of the API, the server-side system, and the API itself, as opposed to, let's say, in a browser. Do I have some flexibility over what it shows me here? And
Sure.
like can I restrict it to just the languages I want it to show? And most notably missing, of course, would be some of the mobile consumption vehicles such as Swift, Objective-C, and Android Java. So
Yep. Yeah, so I actually think that the front end ones, like you said, JavaScript, not Node, JavaScript, and then Swift and Java for Android are three of the coolest use cases for this. That being said, we haven't gotten those ready to go yet, just because, like you also mentioned, like the security is kind of tough because they're front end languages. It makes it really hard to lock them down. So yeah, for this, we don't have a front end stuff yet. We're going to release them the next few weeks where you can actually consume it from the front end. For right now, it's back end only, for better or for worse.
Very good.
But yeah, I think that they're, because I think that people just want to be able to build stuff, and JavaScript's a pretty easy language to learn because there's so much out there. And I would love to be in a world where a non-technical or semi-technical person could build a really quick app where the backend is a service. Kind of like, if you remember Parse by any chance.
Yeah, sure, of course. Yeah, I remember Parse. It hit when it landed. It was great, and then they actually did some really wonderful things in terms of developer engagement, and then they kind of went away as fast as they came. So
yep, they got bought by Facebook, and that's kind of it for whatever reason. But the concept was really cool, where it was a backend as a service, and you could just write a Swift app and not have to worry about the boilerplate stuff. So back to the
I'm looking at here. Did you click on? Yeah.
Apologies, I go back.
Before you clicked on Node, or you clicked on that.
Okay, no. Let's click on Node. We can click on Node. So Node pops open, and we get. If I go to copy it, you'll see that we're gonna like. Actually, I'm gonna go right into that. Let me quickly go in here, so you can see the request parameters. You can see the responses, all that. I'm gonna copy the code quickly. And it says I need an API key. So we'll click this. We'll log in first because it's not going to work unless we have an API key. So we'll do that. And okay, so right now we have an API key. This API key can be used for any service on Readme. Credit cards attached to it. So if the service costs money, then it takes care of billing and everything. And that'll alert you and everything. It doesn't charge without you asking. Okay. And we could copy and paste this and run it, and it would work. Just make it a little simpler. We'll run the command line version. So we'll go back to this, and I can run it. And this time looks very similar to what we just did, but it's actually hitting the server now. It'll take a second because the first time the service hits a little slow, but there we go. We got our math.
This is like similar to a curl command, eh? Just a little bit different.
Yep. So I'll say the curl command. One thing you'll notice, like here, let's look at the Node thing. It's very similar to an SDK. You'll see that there's no URLs, there's no header params, there's no URL encodings, there's nothing like that. Like the whole point is to really strip APIs down to the most basic level possible. So we're calling, API, we're calling PW, which is what we call the programmable web. And it uses a registry to kind of figure out where to direct that. There's no URLs, so of course it's not good for everyone. There's bigger companies that need more control, they need headers, they need stuff like that. The goal of this is to pare it down as much as possible. And in a second, I'll show you why that's actually really cool, other than the fact that it's really simple. So I'm going to refresh here, and we should see, actually let me call it. I'm going to grab this. I'm just going to call it on the command line. Okay. So I'm going to have to install the API tool locally as well. We have my API key. We have all the code. For some reason, Vim's not very happy with me today.
Love the fact that you use Vim. I mean, like, pretty hardcore, my friend.
I'm doing this just to impress you, David.
I mean, you could use Sublime or Atom, any one of the great code editors out there, but you use Vim. Okay.
Well, I think this is not going to work because for whatever reason I upgraded Xcode and nothing's happy with me right now. In theory, it would work. And we bought API, the package name or the gem or whatever, in a bunch of languages. So we have it in Ruby and Python and Node and PHP. So it's really easy to call. You just call like API or whatever. Okay, so you see down here we have logs now. So this was a log from the call we just made. You can see that I passed in 5 and 3. The response was 15. Let's say that for whatever reason, I don't think that's right. I don't think 5 times 3 should be 15. This is where it starts to get really cool. I can create an issue and I can say like, wrong number. I don't think 5 times 3 is equal to 15. I'm clearly wrong about that, but like for the sake of argument,
I get it.
say,
Yeah, this is you're basically this is kind of like a GitHub issue.
Yep. But the cool thing about this, though, is that if I submit it, the creator of the API will actually be able to see
Get a report.
logs. Yep. So they'll be able to see like, oh, you know,
they see the context. They see.
Yep.
I can see down there. Well, what do they call it from? You know.
Yep. It's written in Node. Yep. It's written. We use the command line thing. Like it's. You know, it kind of makes it really easy for debugging and going back and forth. And this is all a very contrived example, of course. To your point earlier, because I created this API, I can like see everyone who's using it. Currently, it's just me. But like I can view everyone's logs. I could block myself, or I could block someone else using it. If I made this private, it would be opt-in. I could like only add just you, David, if I had a private API. One cool thing that I want to talk about that we haven't talked about yet is versioning. So one of the hardest things about APIs is they break all the time. Let's say that you have an API, you fix a bug, that could break someone's API out there. So for us, all versions are immutable, which means that if I make a change and then I launch a new version, whenever the consumer started using an API, they're locked in that version forever. So like, let's say I release a version 2, but you start using it on version 1, you're still locked in version 1 until you upgrade, which means that the cool thing about that, it means that in theory, your API will never break. You don't have to worry about parameters being removed.
But I could selectively eliminate version 1 if I want to, right? I mean, you can imagine like from an API provider's point of view, they do often have multiple versions in production at any given point in time. But at some point they start to fully deactivate those versions because it's just too expensive to support, maintain 30 different versions in the wild, right? So you can still manage that.
So there is a way to, I could mark as deprecated, which is a very soft deprecation, which will just give you a warning that says, hey, you should upgrade to version 2.
How does it give you that warning?
Sure. So
you don't have to show it. I'm just mean like, does it send me an email as a registered user? Does it show up in the response to the API call? Like what happens?
So both. You'll get an email that says, hey, your version is deprecated, you should upgrade. If you were to try to upgrade, it would be able to kind of know what parameters you've been using, what endpoints you're using, and it can it can't definitely know that nothing's going to break, but it can kind of be like, yeah, it seems like things are going to be okay. You can see stats of who's using what endpoints and stuff like that as the creator. So that's a soft deprecation. You also get, every time a call is made, it'll log it out in the command line. It'll say, you know, hey, you're on version 1, but version 2, it's deprecated. You should upgrade to version 2.
This is if you're using the CLI, not a...
both. It's also, if you're calling it programmatically, it'll log it to the logs.
Oh, it logs to the logs, but it doesn't come back in the response to the whatever else comes in.
No user will see it. It's only in the logs. And
so check your logs. That's pretty important.
Yes. Yeah. And you'll get an email as well, so it's not a huge deal. And then you can do a hard deprecation, and you could say, okay, everyone on version 1 we're deleting version 1. Everyone has to go to version 2. And that would be a break and change, but in theory, we give you enough tools to kind of know. You'll be able to say like, oh, okay, only 20 people are using this one endpoint that we changed or deleted. And we know that we've been warning them for a month. They should know it's coming. Kind of we're still letting people deprecate stuff or delete stuff, but we're making it so that hopefully when you do it, you can see statistics and see, okay, I can safely delete this because only 4 people are using it, and they're not really using it. They use it once in a while, and it sucks, but I think we can delete it for these 4 people, and they'll get mad. But at least you have that knowledge.
One thing as I listen to you talk about it and look at it, I think that you said this sort of targets smaller businesses, startups, that kind of thing that are just getting going. But I could imagine larger like enterprises using this to prototype the design of an API and get something up and running pretty quickly that developers can play with, particularly the reporting issue where you can report issues, because it is exactly that one thing that's often missing in the API lifecycle, which is the ability to get the designers and the product manager and the developers collaborating over the design of the API to make sure that by the time you're ready to put it in production, it totally rocks, right? So
yeah, and like, I mean, we're both familiar with like mocking services or whatever, but like
yeah,
we could make our own little mocking service, oops, wrong file, by going in and, rather than touching the database, we could just like do like API.success and just pass out data that we hard coded and, make a mocking service ourselves.
right.
So yeah, there's a lot of really cool options there.
Are there any other really awesome features that you're super proud of that you want to give us a show before we sign off?
There's actually, there's one more thing that I think is really worth showing. And it's, so one of the, I don't want to say bad things, clearly I don't do marketing, but one of the, things that might elicit pushback on this is that we don't give you a lot of options. When you enter data in, it has to be flat. There's no nested, JSON blobs you can pass in. It has to be, flat data structure. When you get data back, it has to be, in a certain format. There's a reason for that. It's not because we're trying to restrict people. It's because, like I said before, I don't think that to use an API, you should have to know Python or Rails or whatever. So I'm going to show you how it works with Slack. So I've already added to Slack. If you hadn't added to Slack already, you would just click this button and go through an OAuth flow. But I can copy and paste this little snippet, and I can go into Slack, and I can just run it. And it's running it, and we get 15 back. And the point is that I think that APIs, we don't have this yet, but imagine it could be an Alexa skill. It could be a text message that you send and get the response back. There's a cool company called Clearbit. If you're familiar with it, they're an API company. You pass in an email address, you get back a name. Why should you need to do that via Python or Rails? Why can't there be, and they do have all these things. Why can't there be a Slack integration? Why can't there be a Salesforce integration, stuff like that? Like, rather than forcing people, and Stripe is on it as well. Like, Stripe has an API, but they've also built a bunch of other ways to consume their API. They have JavaScript widgets that take care of all the, like, do a lot of magic for you, stuff like that. And so Google Sheets, we have a Google Sheets integration. I'm not going to show that because it's a little more clunky or a little more like, tough to get going and everything. But, it's really cool just to be able to highlight, a list of numbers, hit multiply, and then, on the third column have all the multiplication stuff. And again, contrived example, you don't need an API for that.
Google Sheets can probably do that on its own, but I get the point that you're trying to make.
Math is a very contrived example, but imagine if like there's a database.
Yeah, if you had a column of email addresses, it could go out. Yeah.
Yep. Okay. Currency conversions, things like that. So yeah, I mean, that's the end of my demo. That's pretty much it. It's, we're launching now, and we're pretty excited to kind of see how people use it. There's a lot of cool use cases: internal microservices, external public APIs. We're excited to see how people use it.
Okay, maybe we can turn the screen share off so we can go back to our video mode here.
Sounds great. Maybe
so we can see each other.
Perfect.
Okay, so last few questions here. So you're just now announcing it. What's the business model here? What does it take for somebody to? I know you mentioned that if the API is public, you don't have to pay for it. I'm curious about the rationale behind that decision. And then if I make it private, maybe tell us a little bit about that, because it looks like your endpoint is sort of a public endpoint. You're just so I'm wondering how I get it behind my firewall if that's what I want to do.
Sure. So the business model is, originally we were going to charge people to create APIs, but that seemed like it was punishing the wrong people. It was punishing, and of course most business models are sort of punishing popularity, but
punishing somebody.
Yeah. The way that it works is that it's kind of like GitHub basically, where you wouldn't charge someone on GitHub if they're building an open source project. Our APIs aren't open source, but they're open access, could be a good way to put it. Where it's free to build, and if you're consuming, that's when you start to pay. It's free to consume until you hit the rate limit threshold for different APIs, and then you have to buy, more calls.
What's the rate limit? Is there a rate? Do you know what they are offhand?
Sure. We'll see. We kept them low. We're gonna keep raising them, but right now it's 100,000 API calls is free for consuming public APIs. Per
day,
API key. Per month. Sorry, per month.
Per month. Okay.
Yep. So you can make 100,000 API calls for free, and then if it's more than that, it starts at $10 a month. Okay. And honestly, that's not the business model in the sense that we're not trying to make money off that. That's just more of a
Mhm.
limit so that, people don't write, infinite loops that really just crush servers or whatever.
Right.
So the actual business model is two parts. One is something that we offer now, and one is something that's going to come in the next few weeks. Right now, what we do is if you want it to be an internal private API, meaning that either you work at a company and it's an internal microservice, or if you work at a company, you only want 3 or 4 people to be able to access it. Maybe you build an API for partners, like a partner API. Then we would charge per API key that accesses it. It's $10 a month.
With no rate limits?
There are rate limits, but they're much higher. It's a million, I believe, a million hits. And then if you want more, if you want more, that's
million
$10.
For $10, a million hits per month per API.
Yep.
Per API key.
Per API key, yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
and we'll see how that goes. I'm not really sure the order of magnitude of what people are going to do, so we might raise those. We'll see. But
and how do I get that behind my firewall, or can I?
Yep. So right now the answer is no, but that is pending interest, which I'm sure there will be interest. Because I think as far as business models goes, I think this is not going to make us much money early on because we want to encourage free APIs. Down the line, I think the magic is not that we're hosting it. Like no one cares that part because they want to host on their own infrastructure. I think the real strength is that the user experience. Like we're not a technology company, we're a user experience company is the way I kind of look at it. So we'll have an on-premise version eventually, depending on how interested people are or whatever. And I think that'd be great for people who want to use it just internally as their microservice, kind of a lightweight microservice, kind of management provider. Obviously, as you know, there's some Google has released one, a bunch of big companies have released some really powerful microservice stuff. This would kind of be targeted as the people who are, they want to use microservices, they want the features I just showed you, but they don't need a mesh network that is, scaling for billions of users.
Sure.
They want something that's, more usability than.
And if I need to connect that to, my own data sources, that's all done in that first chunk of code that you were showing us where you.
Yeah, you would write just like if you were connected to the database using Heroku, you would just, pull in Mongo and you would, write or Postgres or whatever. Same exact way. We don't
make API calls to other services.
Yeah. A lot of people using us now just use it as almost a proxy. Not great, but it actually is nice because they can do whatever they want on their own servers behind their firewall, and we basically take care of the UI, UX, simplifying it. So we have a lot of people using us as a proxy now as well.
Okay, well, Greg Koberger, founder of Readme.io, announcing Readme. Is it Readme Build? Is that what it's called?
Yep, we just call it Readme Build. So
Readme Build, announcing Readme Build. So congratulations on the launch, and we wish you luck with the product. And we look forward to catching up with you the next time you have some other great announcement.
Sounds great. Thank you so much for having me.